I'm gonna talk today about health, like everybody is, but I'm gonna be talking much more about our own health as designers and people working adjacent to design. And like many of you, I come out of a background in UX, so I spent a lot of years doing consulting work in UX, information architecture, content strategy. A lot of people know me as a content person. And then over the years, I started getting very, very interested in what is the responsibility that we have as designers for the things that we're putting in the world. So a few years ago now, back in 2017, I wrote this book. It's called Technically Wrong: Sexist Apps, Biased Algorithms, and Other Threats of Toxic Tech. They put a lot in that subtitle, didn't they? Yeah. And when I wrote that book, I was really interested in connecting the dots between a lot of different harmful and inhumane practices that I was seeing out there in design. I noticed some small things, or things at least at their surface seemed small, like this. This is a notification that actually a friend of mine received from Etsy marketplace for buying creative kind of handmade goods. They wanted her to shop for Valentine's Day. She got this notification that says, "Move over, Cupid, we've got what he wants," only her partner is a woman. And she read that notification and she thought, well, it's okay, this isn't ruining my life, but I sure don't feel included here. I don't feel like this is a very thoughtful decision for a company like Etsy. And it kind of hurt her, just that little bit. And then there were other things that I was seeing over and over, and many of them were actually in products or services that were related to health. Yeah, this is a notification that the wife of somebody I know received from their Withings Smart Scale. Congratulations, you've hit a new low weight. In this particular example, my friend's wife was pregnant, and then she had the baby. Okay, so that's a little bit funny, but think about all the situations in which this notification would not be funny. Think about people who are dealing with something like an eating disorder. Think about people who are dealing with cancer treatment. Think about all the reasons somebody might not want to be congratulated for losing weight, particularly in a society where, from what I've seen in Europe, it's pretty similar to the US in the sense that fat phobia is everywhere, and people feel pretty bad about weight already. They didn't sign up for this particular notification. There wasn't something you checked at sign up that said, yeah, send me the weight shaming stuff. No, this is just what the scale decided was important. And there were so many examples like this, again, oftentimes in health-related applications. This was from one of my favorite, and by that I mean least favorite, period tracking apps called Glow. What Glow does is it's supposed to tell people about their reproductive health. And it's supposed to tell people if they menstruate, like when they can expect to menstruate, but also things like when might you be fertile. Now, one of the notifications it has is that this is a day where you're on your period, right? And it says, snuggle away. And I read that and I was like, this is the most condescending message, as if like my app is giving me permission on what I can or cannot do with my partner because it's based off of my menstrual cycle. What? Who? How? This isn't what I got this app for. Okay, so I looked at so many issues like this, over and over, places where design had gone from maybe mildly exclusive, kind of leaving some audiences out, to deeply, deeply harmful. And along the way, I started talking to a lot of companies. Over and over again, I would talk to organizations about how they were including different groups in their design process, or whether they'd thought about who they might be harming along the way. And what happened is that I kept having really similar conversations with designers who are working in those organizations. They would say to me, I want to speak up about this. I want to be able to make change in my organization, but I don't feel like I have power. I feel scared to speak up. I don't think I'll be listened to. I don't want to be seen as difficult. I heard these comments so many times that over and over, I started thinking, gosh, how do I help those people? How do I help those people make better sense of how they're going to show up in their work, be courageous in their work, speak up for things that matter? And so, in a couple of years, I decided that what I wanted to do was actually pivot all of the work that I was doing away from consulting on projects or products and toward working with people. So I made this big shift for myself, where I launched this organization, Active Voice, tiny company, but company nonetheless, where it's all about helping people with more inclusive and ethical leadership in design and tech. This was a huge decision for me. This was a very scary decision for me because I had been consulting for about 10 years at that point, and I kind of knew how to do that work. And I knew that running a business like this was going to be very, very different, but I was excited and I knew it was the right choice for me. So confident about it. Except for one thing, which you will notice, which is the date on this post is February 26th, 2020. And so the next few weeks after that were interesting. And by interesting, I mostly mean that they were terrifying. I was so scared. I was scared, obviously, for the reasons everybody was scared, right? Like people were trapped at home. We didn't know a lot about COVID at that point. I saw mass layoffs happening in my communities. Also, who wants to talk about anything but COVID at that particular moment? Who was going to reach out to me? What was I doing? I was worried. And that is the context when the COVID tracking project reached out to me. So the COVID tracking project was a grassroots effort that actually formed out of the Atlantic magazine, which is a whole long story. But it formed because at the time, in the early parts of the pandemic, and actually for a much longer part of the pandemic, the United States was not gathering or sharing good data about what was going on. I'm not sure how much you know about this, but in the United States, our data was a mess. I mean, it was a mess. It was inconsistent from state to state. It was often delayed in coming out. It was often unclear what was really happening. There was no centralized information. It was really hard to see trends or patterns. The COVID tracking project had hundreds of volunteers who were gathering data across every single part of the United States, which is, as you know, very large, and trying to pull that together. And so when they got in touch with me, what they did is they asked me to lead this work stream where I was helping them with something called the COVID Racial Data Tracker. So this is a project in collaboration with Kendi Ibram and the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. And what we wanted to do was look at the massive disparity that we were seeing in health outcomes for people of color in the United States. And specifically for Black Americans, what we knew was that Black Americans were getting sick and dying at much higher rates than the overall population. Much, much higher rates. We knew that, but again, the data was a mess. The data was terrible. Some states were not reporting race and ethnicity data, so you knew there was a disparity anecdotally, but you couldn't really show it. Some states were using different racial categories than the US Census uses, so it was really hard to make comparisons across different places. Some states released data regularly, some very irregularly, and in a lot of places, they would only have race or ethnicity information for something like half of their cases. And so what that meant is that we knew the disparity was big, and we knew it was a real problem. But it was very hard to put your arms around that problem and to talk about the inequality and the inequity that led to that problem. So there I was. I joined up to lead UX and product work to build out this thing, which included two things. This sort of state-by-state dashboard, where there's a screenshot of just one state, Minnesota there. So we had this dashboard for every state that was updated every single time we got new data every day. And then there was a kind of high-level, more editorial part of this that was about sharing stories, analysis, et cetera, about what was going on. And I was so excited to work on this. So excited to work on this because, as I told you from my background, this was something I cared a lot about. I cared a lot about the equity of what we were producing digitally. I cared a lot about the health outcomes for my fellow Americans. I was also under a lot of pressure because the partners we were working with, they had already promised a deadline to some of their partners that were giving them funding. And also, they weren't really familiar with building a product like this. They had never worked on something like this kind of scale of digital experience. And I was running this team of volunteer designers, developers, writers, illustrators, trying to get everything pulled together. And I pushed so hard. I was sketching out interfaces. I was writing interface copy. I was writing project briefs. I was in 200 message deep Slack threads with a master of public health trying to figure out, okay, if we have this data and this data, can we say with confidence that there is a health disparity here? And how will we flag that? And what is an ethical way to show that information? I was also in conference calls with a MacArthur Genius Fellow and a National Book Award winner who terrified me. So during all of this, I felt so responsible for the outcome. I felt so responsible for getting this quality product out the door as quickly as we could, because obviously time was of the essence. And so what I found is I started making some really knee-jerk decisions. For example, one of them I remember so clearly was that a designer who I really respect, they came to me and they said, hey, on this dashboard, right now we're displaying people's race in the same order that the US Census does. And the problem with that is that the US Census puts white people first. We could talk about why that is. The short answer is because that's how we've always done it. The long answer has a lot to do with racism. But that is how it is in the census. And do you know what I said to this designer? No. That was my first response. No. Well, we can't do that. Well, we don't have a good reason to go against the census. Like the census police were going to come after me. Like I don't know what I thought was going to happen. But my knee-jerk response was no, we cannot do that. Ultimately, we launched this thing. I am so proud of the work that this team did under terrible circumstances to make it happen. I'm not proud of the way that I worked with this team. I am not proud of it because I realized some things. When I joined this project, I told myself I was joining it because I cared deeply about public access to clear and complete racial inequity data. And that was true. But that was only one part of the story. Because the other part of the story I couldn't see at the time. When I'm honest with myself, though, I know that I also joined the project because I felt powerless about the pandemic and anxious about my own work pivot. And because I wasn't attending to those feelings, because I was using this project as a way to cope with what was happening around me, I wasn't able to do this work in a way that was actually healthy for me or for the people that I was working with. We launched some big things, and I am proud of it, but I think the human cost of that work was too high. And I actually left that project pretty shortly after we launched that work. And sometime after that, I learned about this woman, Laura van der Noot-Lipsky. She's a social worker, and she spent decades on the front lines of trauma work. She worked in emergency rooms. She worked in domestic violence centers. She went to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and spent several months living and working with people who were experiencing profound loss. She was experienced at what she did, and one day she woke up and she couldn't do it anymore. She kept trying to push through and just get through her days, and instead what she found was that she found herself standing at the edge of a cliff, having what she later realized was a psychotic break. And coming out of that experience, she founded an organization called the Trauma Stewardship Institute, which is all focused on how do we actually cope with the stressful experiences we have. And while she created it for people who are working in caring professions, I think all of us who deal with stressful things at work, which is all of us, can learn a lot from that. One of the things that I learned from them was some of the things that happen in your brain, for all humans, when we're exposed to trauma and overwhelm. There's a lot of examples here, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I do want to talk about a couple, though. One of them is this one, being intense, rigid, and controlling, unable to embrace complexity. That's some of what I was feeling on that project. I wanted something to control during a time when everything felt out of control. And so I was intense in the way that I approached that work. And when that designer came to me and wanted to make a change, I was rigid. No. And I was rigid because we had an unreasonable deadline that we'd honestly made up, and I felt like I had to stick to it. Also, I couldn't see that we had options. I had lost my sense of creativity. I wasn't able to be creative, and I retrenched to the status quo in a moment where I really needed to listen to what the people around me were saying. And that means I couldn't uphold the very values that had brought me to that work because I wasn't dealing with my own stress. It has been over 2 years since I left that project. And now I know I am so not the only one who had that experience of struggling to cope. In fact, as of August of this year, so new data, this is 2022 data, Slack Future Forum, which is a study of over 10,000 knowledge workers, they found that 40% of global knowledge workers were reporting a feeling of burnout. They did not release specific numbers for Switzerland, and I'm guessing because they don't have enough data, but they did have numbers for France, UK, and Germany. Germany, it's about 1/3. France and UK were both 40% or more. We have burnout everywhere. And so I also know a little bit about what was happening within my own communities. Earlier this year, I asked how the pandemic has changed people's relationships to work. So I did this little research project, and I had 236 people who responded, mostly in design and all in design and tech. About half of them were specifically in like UX or product design. And I heard over and over again stories like this. While I adore design, I'm so burned out by always being asked to do more, do it faster, and prioritize cutting parts of my process in order to deliver. Growth across so many companies is often more versus better, and it's exhausting that companies are pretending we all don't clearly see this. This product designer really tapped into something that was common in this research. People were telling me that they were so frustrated at what was happening in their organizations, and they felt so powerless against it, and it was draining them. It wasn't just the pandemic, it was work and the pandemic layered on top that took them to a breaking point. This person said, I've probably been burned out for a long time, but multiple years in a pandemic brought that to a head. When the world changed suddenly, my work only increased their expectations. Work is the only thing during the pandemic that was unrelenting. That language, even unrelenting, I feel exhausted just thinking about it that way. So knowing that this is the context that people are in, what I want to talk with you all today is the importance of being able to design for our own health if we ever want to be able to design for anybody else's. Because if we don't, our relationships to our work suffer, we get cynical, we lose our love for design, and we stop being able to show up to our work as the kind of people we need to be to do good in the world. And in fact, when you look at the core facets of burnout, like the clinical facets of burnout, you can see how each one of them maps to problems that we would face in design or limitations to our design work. One of the facets of burnout is emotional exhaustion, meaning like I'm tapped out of feelings. I feel shut down and overwhelmed. When we are in that state, what we don't do is we don't go have a hard conversation. We don't go, hey, I want to talk with you about a concern I had. No, that's because that's hard. That takes a lot of emotional energy and you don't have it. So we stay silent. We let things go by. We also become detached. We become avoidant and distant from our colleagues. They're over there and we're kind of holding ourselves back. In that space, we don't collaborate. We might say we're collaborating, like we're in a Zoom together or we're in a conference room together, but we actually don't really listen very well. We don't hear diverse points of view, and that's going to put limitations on what we can actually deliver in our work. Another thing that we do is we depersonalize. So depersonalization is basically we see ourselves and one another as less human. When we lose track of other people's humanity, and even our own humanity, it's very easy to lose compassion. It's very easy to start feeling desensitized to the harm that people are experiencing or the pain that they're experiencing. We care less about other people's suffering when we're in this state. Burnout also leads to cynicism. When we are cynical, we are biased toward negative perspectives, right? We all have negative perspectives. I have like 10 negative perspectives at any one time. And I also have positive ones. But when we are in a state of burnout, we lose the positivity, and all we see are all of the things that are impossible, inevitable. We start thinking, why even bother? Because we feel so powerless. And so we treat harm in our products, we treat the things that could happen that are negative to our users as if we have no other option. Burnout Burnout can also lead to this sense of chronic dissatisfaction, meaning we are critical of everything. We don't enjoy things anymore. And in that state, we shut down ideas very quickly. We can't come up with creative solutions. We don't see creative solutions at all. They're invisible to us because we're so focused on the negative and we are so focused on critiquing. And when we are in this place, we are not going to do the design work that our users deserve, and we are not going to do the work that we are going to feel proud of. So we need to get to a place where we're able to really process the stress that we have. To process the stress, because the stress is going to happen, right? Like that just happens. That's just part of life. Stress happens, and sometimes a lot of stress happens. But we need to work through that stress because we talk oftentimes about burnout as if it's just about the number of hours that you worked. It's not true. Burnout is a repetitive stress injury. That means you're feeling too much work stress for too long, and you don't know what to do with it, and that leads to burnout. And when you take the global stressors of the last 3 years and you pair them with the individual stressors so many of us feel on the job, right? We are in a rough place. When we look at our stress, like when we actually are willing to acknowledge it and spend time with it, which is what a lot of us avoid doing, we just no, I'm fine. When we actually look at it though, that's what helps us let go of it. That's what helps us behave a little differently. And that means talking about our stress in more specific terms. I really love using a feelings wheel for this. It might seem silly. I know what I'm feeling. I don't need something like that. Yeah, guess what? Actually, you might. Because so often, especially at work, we just say, how are you doing? And it's like, you say good or okay, right? Or maybe you'll say stressed. I'm stressed. That's like an acceptable thing to express about your work. But when we say stress, we have to look at what's underneath that. Sometimes what you're feeling is actually fear. A lot of stress is really about being scared. I'm scared that if I don't get this done by deadline, I'm not going to get the promotion I've been working toward. I'm scared you're going to think less of me. But we don't talk about that as fear. We just, stressed, it's stressed, it's stressed. And so we don't actually process that because we don't look at it directly. Another one is anger. And I will tell you, this is a big one I find amongst women, because frequently, women are taught from an early age not to be angry and not to express anger. And if that happens to you over and over again, you may not even be comfortable acknowledging to yourself that you're angry. And so it all gets turned into just generic stress. It's like sometimes you're not stressed, you're tired and angry and hurt at being talked over in meetings. And until you can actually talk about that, it's really hard to let go of it. It's really hard to figure out how to get to a different place. And so what I recommend is to practice not just being stuck in the feeling of stress, but to actually observe your own emotions. And to observe them without judging them, without saying like, oh, I shouldn't feel this way. Because this is what we often do. We start to notice a feeling, we go, I shouldn't be angry. I'm sure they didn't mean it that way. And the thing is, whether they meant it that way or not, if you're angry, you're angry. That's just how feelings work. You don't stop having a feeling by telling yourself you shouldn't have the feeling. And in fact, if somebody's ever said to you, you shouldn't be mad, I guarantee it didn't make you not feel mad. In fact, it might have made it feel worse. So once we acknowledge and we name our feelings, then we can actually start to move through them. We can start to discharge them, let go of them. Now, for a lot of us, it's very hard to be non-judgmental and compassionate with ourselves because we immediately go to a place of comparison. We say things like, well, I've had it pretty good. I don't deserve to feel this bad. And I hear this a lot, particularly amongst folks who are relatively privileged, right? People like you and me, I would presume, because we're here at a conference. Like, that's a privileged space to be in the first place. And so in that state, what you might find is that you think, well, I have it good compared to other people. This might be true. That first sentence, yeah. Second sentence, though, again, that takes us to a place where we're not allowing ourselves to acknowledge the truth. We're not acknowledging what is actually happening, and so we can't process it. And it really sets up a binary. That binary where there are two options. You can either be privileged or you can be struggling, but you can't be both. We are so quick to reduce human experience to a binary. People are strong or weak, good or bad. It's a very familiar way of dividing up the world. But what it does is it puts us into this place of scarcity, makes us believe that not everybody deserves to get their needs met, or that not everybody deserves to have a healthy experience, that if I have it good in some ways, I don't deserve care. That there's only so much to go around. But the reality is, we don't have to pick between you or me when it comes to who gets to have feelings, right? We all get to have them, and we can all work together to make a healthier and safer environment for everybody. And to do that, we need to be able to replace judgment with curiosity. So we need to be able to say, okay, I respect that everybody's experience matters here. So how can we stop being judgmental with ourselves and then actually show up to the people around us with more space for them as well? There's a few questions that I would recommend you ask yourself. One of them is, what has work felt like for me lately? Oh, and if you manage people, ask these questions to your team. See what's going on with them. So what has work felt like for me lately? And another one that I love to ask is, what's draining me most right now? In this moment, so many people I talk to feel really drained, and getting specific about what is draining them can make a huge difference. Some really common things that might be taking it out of you at work, things like negotiating conflict and disagreement, lots of changes in strategy or priorities, tasks that don't have a clear purpose, fighting for resources, justifying your role, justifying that you deserve to be there, navigating red tape, feeling unseen or unheard when you speak up. These things can really drain your energy, and it's then important to think about, well, what do I need more of right now? So getting your needs met at work can sometimes be challenging, but there's a few things to think about, and one of them is this model called biceps. Belonging, improvement, choice, equality or fairness, predictability, and significance. It comes from a woman named Paloma Medina, whose work is wonderful. You should check her out. And it's basically that everybody has these core needs at work. We all have some level of these needs. And all of them have been threatened over the last few years in all kinds of ways. Think about it, right? Some of them are obvious. A lot of us felt like our sense of belonging fall apart when we went suddenly remote. Predictability, that went out the window for a lot of people over the past few years. But other ones might be a little bit more under the surface, like significance. In a lot of organizations, people felt like things were stalled in terms of they weren't getting promotions, they weren't getting visibility for their work because everybody was so focused elsewhere. Your sense of significance goes away, and that can definitely contribute to feeling less satisfied and potentially burnt out. Understanding your core needs and understanding where they're not being met can make a huge difference in you being able to then understand your stress, process it, and then move to a place where you can sort of redefine what success looks like for yourself in this moment. So when I say redefine success, I say that because, well, during this last few years, I have talked to so many people who have felt like the goals they were trying to hit are actually impossible. These are people who are telling me that they feel chronically unsuccessful. And so this is a really important point. Burnout is not just about your workload, right? I talked about that. It's about chronic stress and the chronic lack of a feeling of success. Meaning if you keep spinning and spinning and spinning and you're not moving forward, you become exhausted physically from the effort, and you become exhausted emotionally from the feeling that you're not getting anywhere, the feeling of failure, feeling stalled and stuck. A question I encourage you to ask yourself is, what is important to me now? How have my goals changed? For a lot of us, the pandemic really revealed that there were things that we didn't necessarily love about our lives or about our working life. Maybe we realized we want to spend more time with our families. Lots of people moved to places that were different than where they were living before. People made big life choices. Have you paused and asked yourself how you've changed and how that relates to your work? What does that mean for your goals now? Once we understand how our goals have changed, we can start looking at, well, what am I doing day to day? Because so often we tell ourselves, I have to keep doing this. I have to keep working toward all the things I was working to before. I have to. But as long as we keep saying I have to, we're getting to a place where we're going to feel really powerless, like we don't have choices. And so I want to come back to Laura Vandernoot Lipsky of the Trauma Stewardship Institute. What she found was that to cope with stress and to heal, we need to be able to recognize that we are making choices. Not about everything. There are many things where you may not have power in your life, right? I assume most of you have to do some kind of work in order to make money, in order to have a house and eat, right? So do I. You may not have choice about everything, but that doesn't mean that we are totally powerless. So what she says is that we need to ask ourselves every day, why am I doing what I'm doing? And then remind ourselves gently that you are making a choice to do this work. And that might mean reframing some of our choices. Instead of saying, I have to work all evening and weekend to get enough done, it feels like you have to, but it's actually that I'm choosing to overwork because why? And you can ask yourself, well, why am I choosing this? Well, maybe I'm afraid my manager won't promote me otherwise. Or maybe it's because you feel responsible for bad design going out the door that would hurt users. Now, once you ask yourself those questions, or once you ask yourself why it is you're doing what you're doing, you can ask some questions of that too. Well, wait a second. Is it really my personal responsibility to make sure this organization isn't doing harm? Where's the organizational responsibility? Wait a second. If this company will only promote me if I'm willing to work on the weekends, is this the company I want to get promoted at? Once we start asking ourselves some different kinds of questions, then we can start to really figure out, well, what's meaningful to me now? Not what was meaningful to me in 2019, but what is actually meaningful to me now in this very different era of life. Because again, it's not just about workload, it is about feeling powerless. When we feel powerless, when we feel like we don't have options, it is so much harder to get by, and it is so much more draining on a day-to-day basis. And there are a lot of things out of our control, for sure. Recognizing what's in your control, though, makes all the difference. Humans crave a sense of control. However, I will tell you that a lot of times we find control in some unhelpful places. So, some things that I see people do when they're looking for something to control that are actually not great are things like micromanaging, refusing to delegate, perfectionism. Perfectionism is a big one. That is about control. If I just make this perfect, it'll be okay. Oh, and I can't share my work with you until it's perfect, because then it's out of my control and you might see me. Other stuff is nitpicking, questioning our team's work, being slow to praise and quick to criticism. Other things with management I see a lot is like surveillance, which there's a lot of that happening. Surveilling how long people are working and where they are working, kind of like keeping tabs on whether somebody's Slack icon goes to inactive during the day. Being rigid and unable to adapt or shift gears. These are the ways that we try to get control when things feel out of control, if we're not paying attention. We cannot always control the circumstances around us. The one thing we always can control is how we choose to react to them. The response that we have is our number one locus of control. And so, a question I encourage you to ask yourself in moments of stress is, how do I want to show up in this moment? What behavior will I be proud of later? Because you will not control all the terrible things that happen in the world, and you will not control your company's policy unless it's a company where you are directly in charge of the company policy. But what you can control is, who do I want to be in this moment? What I can control here is, what is the behavior that I'm okay with? What will let me sleep at night? What that means is that you can define success on your project, success in your work, not according to outcomes that are outside of your control, like your boss or even your users, but to be able to say, do I feel good about how I showed up to this? Because then you always at least have that. And that brings me to a final piece here about how we can help deal with burnout, come back from it, prevent it in the first place. And that's really about resetting our priorities, really allowing ourselves to have priorities in our work and in our careers. I remember I was at a conference a few months ago, and I heard Amy Thibodeau, who's the chief design officer at Gusto, speak, and she had this quote that had just rung in my head for hours. Be opinionated about what projects are worth your precious time. And I say that because I love this word precious here. I think for a lot of us, we don't treat our personal time as precious. We treat our time as not that important. In fact, routinely in organizations, what I see is people who are so busy working to make it easier on their team, to make things better for users, and then at their own personal expense, because they've devalued their own time. They've devalued their experience in service of other people's. And the thing is, that's never going to be enough, because there are so many problems out there that you could be spending your time on. Even if you sacrifice your physical health, and you sacrifice your relationships, and you sacrifice your mental well-being, there is still so much out there that you would not be able to solve. This is meant to be an overwhelming list of things, and this is just a small sampling of the kinds of problems that we see right now in design and in technology. We see deceptive design patterns, we see racist financial algorithms, we see ableism, we see exclusion, we see data collection that is unethical. We see so many issues in design and in tech, so many issues that we can so easily get overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed just looking at this one slide. Yeah. And so whenever I get overwhelmed, I think about this post I read from Desiree Attaway in 2020. She's the founder of an organization called the Attaway Group, and they do diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting, and they do a lot of training and guidance for organizations to look at how white supremacy shows up at their workplaces. And so you might imagine that in 2020, they started getting a lot of phone calls from companies. A lot of frantic CEOs who had just watched all of the protests take over in the United States against the murder of George Floyd. They watched these protests happening and they said, oh, we got to do something. We posted our black square on Instagram, and now we should do something, right? So they would call her and they'd say, what do we do? And what she wrote at that time was that, you know what? I am getting so many inquiries and people are knocking on my door, and you know what? I could make this a big business opportunity for myself, but I can't do that, because if I do that, I am just buying into this system that prioritizes busyness, and I don't want to do it. She says, we're busy all the time. We are busy holding pointless meetings, busy planning for next quarter, busy overthinking things and not trusting our decisions. White supremacy loves that. White supremacy knows that when we're exhausted, we remain obedient, and when we're overworked, we tend to stay quiet. It rewards us for our silence, for not pushing back, for not questioning. Now, I am very aware that the racial dynamics in Europe and in Switzerland specifically are very different than the United States, where we have a unique history. What she is talking about is the status quo, and how easy it is for the status quo to stay in place when we are busy, when we are constantly busy and unable to think about what is happening around us. We are perpetually exhausted and unable to push back or fight for the things we care about. We get stuck in the overwhelm. And that's why I think it's so important to think about what we're focusing on right now. What is your agenda at work? What is important to you? Not just for your projects, not just your clients' goals, not just your company's goals. What is important to you, and how can you make that manifest in the work that you are doing? What I mean by that is to think about, where is the intersection of a few things? My values, so the things I believe, the things that are meaningful to me in the world, the stuff that keeps me up at night. My expertise, so what do I know about? Like, for example, I have a friend who is an information architect, and her name is Lisa Maria, and she loves categorizing. She loves thinking about structures. She loves doing all of this work that's very nitty-gritty and nerdy, right? But she used that lens of information architecture to start talking about, how do we categorize people? And what are the ways that the way we categorize people can include or exclude? So she started bringing her values into her information architecture work in a way that was organic to her. And the other thing to think about is your power or your influence. And oftentimes when I talk about power, a lot of folks will be like immediately, oh, I don't really have power in my organization. Like, I'm just a designer. I have to fight to be invited to the meeting in the first place. And that might be true, and there might be lots of places where you don't have power. But again, just by virtue of us being here at a conference today, I would argue that we have some forms of power. We have some forms of social capital. And so I encourage you to ask yourself, where do I have power? Maybe it's a small pocket of power. Maybe it's something like you work on a design system. And if you work on a design system, what you do has an impact across your org. Maybe you happen to have a high-profile project right now with a lot of visibility, and that might give you the ear of somebody important. Maybe you just come from a dominant background. Like for me, in the United States, as a white cis person, I come from a pretty dominant background, and it gives me the ability to speak up about things safely that other people might not have, might be riskier for them. Wherever it is that you have power, find it and tap into it and think about where is it important for you to make an impact and what can you let go of? What isn't yours? Because that overwhelm, that is never going to lead you to a place that you actually want to live in. And it won't lead you to a place where you can do your best work for your audiences either. Ultimately, I think we've been through a lot the last few years. And there's more uncertainty and more stress. There's a war in Ukraine. There's ongoing questions about what's happening with the economy. There's protests in Iran. There's going to be an endless series of issues that we have to face. I'm not even going to talk about climate crisis today. It's too much. So we have been through a lot. We are continuing to go through a lot. And it is clear that so much in our society needs to be redesigned. So much needs to be redesigned. And as designers, I think we need to be part of that. But we can't do it if we're showing up in our place of stress and overwhelm and trauma. We can't do it if we're showing up in a way where we are unable to listen to new voices, where we are unable to see creative options, where we are showing up in a knee-jerk reaction. So instead, what I hope we do next is I hope we take this time to process, to heal, to think about where we've been and where we want to go next, so that we can actually show up with the energy and the compassion that we need to do the work that's in front of us. To design not just for fitness or wellness, but for a healthier future for everyone, including ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Could you give me this one?
Yes.
So thank you so much for your insights and all the things to think about. We're starting the questions at that point until it gets up. I have a question myself. It could be in any particular case that we're leading a transformation within a company, or maybe even a turnaround. So meaning it's coming an era of a lot of stress things, because maybe people have to get let off or changes in the organization.
Change creates stress,
Exactly.
Absolutely, yeah.
And people don't like change, obviously.
No.
Especially if you don't get a sense of why you need to change.
Yeah.
So you have some frustrations coming along. You have stress symptoms. How would you suggest to deal with that, maybe even as a person in charge or someone leading a team?
I will say, actually, if the people in charge deal with their stress in a healthy way and talk about it and make it safer for others, it changes things for everyone. So what I would say is that for somebody in a leadership role particularly, figure out what your personal practice is. So that's things like, it could be a range of things, right? Like some of it is, how do you turn off for the day? Do you give yourself time to take a walk? Do you give yourself like physical activity, right? Like what are the things that you can do? And also things like, do you have a therapist? Which is, I think, something, no, I'm not even gonna say almost. I think everyone can benefit from therapy. Because it helps us just, again, work through, right? Like to talk through the things we're going through, makes them lighter. So if you do that as a leader, you're going to show up in a way that is going to be safer for the other people. The other thing is if you talk about some of that, and not necessarily, you don't have to share all your personal stuff with your team by any means, but if you start talking openly about like, hey, I'm gonna be out of the office taking a walk this afternoon, I've been feeling really stressed, you're creating an environment where other people hear that and normalize it. And then make sure that it is okay for them to do it too, right? Like if you do it, but then they get punished for doing it, that does not work. So I think that that's a big thing, is just continue to do that, like set up your practice for yourself, talk about it with your team, and have some of these conversations too. So some of those questions I posed, they are great questions to talk about with your team. Like, how's work been feeling and what's draining you?
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
So basically, get communicative and talk with people honestly about their feelings. All right. I think we're ready for some questions of the group here. Yeah, again, the question about sharing the presentations.
Yeah. Yes. So, I mean, there's video that'll come out at some point, right? But also slides. Yeah, you can have a slide link. Great. I'm not sure the best way to share it out with everybody, but I have no problem sharing it. And so I'll talk to the organizers to make sure that comes out.
Very good. All right. Next question. Do you think designers are in stress because they regularly need to invest in themselves in little rewarding projects that run away like unstoppable locomotive?
I'm imagining a little rewarding project that you started doing because it felt like fun, and then here it is, it's running away from you and taking over your life. Yeah, I have done that personally, and where it stops being rewarding and it starts just feeling like this endless pressure that you put on yourself. I think that this is a piece of it, and I think some of it might also be that in design, I think culturally, there's often this sense that you need to be doing like lots of creative work that's maybe like separate from like side projects are very common because it feels like, oh, I don't want to just do my job. I need to also be doing other things. And so I think that that pressure can be one that you put on yourself. And for some people, that's really healthy for them. So it's like, I don't get all my needs met at work, but I can get my needs met in this other way. But I think you have to ask yourself, is what I'm doing actually providing me the thing that I meant for it to provide me? If I meant for it to provide me a creative outlet that felt fun, and actually I dread it, but I still feel like I have to do it for 15 hours a week after work, it's time to reevaluate if that's actually additive to your life.
Thank you. Yeah. Another one which got quite some upvotes. How would you try to handle the feel of being the only one doing it? And even if you start to talk about it.
Oh.
So I assume doing it this, right?
Like talking about how you're feeling and how you're doing. Yeah. Okay, this is a real issue. If there is one person who is willing to talk about their stress or talk about their mental health, that's a high burden for them. If there's multiple people, the burden goes down. It becomes normalized. What I would say is that the more power you have in an organization, the greater your responsibility. So, we talked about before, if you're leading a team and it starts with you, you can do that with it being a smaller risk than somebody who's at a junior level. So, that is one of the ways that I think you can really make a difference with your power. But the other thing I would say is that if you are not in a position of power in your organization, you can still start to normalize some of this. And the way that you can do it is by identifying maybe just one or two people that you already have a high level of trust with, and start just making some small steps in the direction of vulnerability with them and seeing what you get back. If you get a response back that is welcoming and supportive, then it's telling you, okay, I can continue. Build those relationships and talk to each other. And talking to each other is also really important because it's how we get solidarity, right? Like that's how we get a sense that like, wait a second, it's not just that I feel like too much pressure is put on me. It's that like everybody feels like that. And maybe some of the expectations in our company aren't humane. And that would be really hard for me to change by myself. But if I start talking to people and we all have that experience, we can start pushing back in different ways. So I think that the thing is find one or two people to start with and keep it small. And also know that you may need to find people who are outside of your work who are definitely safe third parties who can help you process things if you don't feel that safety at your workplace.
Thank you so much. Yeah. We're going to have to end here the Q&A. Please find time in the break to get back to you. I assume you're still here for a couple of minutes?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
I hear there's an apéro after this?
Yes.
I'll be there. All right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This applause is yours.